Therapists of Reddit, what's a dark secret about your work that no one knows? Story 1. How many parents bring their kids in not realizing or unwilling to admit that their parenting is the problem? I went to a psychiatrist exactly once as a child because I had crazy anxiety and stuttering. We never went back because my mom said, and I quote, "I'm not going to pay to be told I'm a bad mom." Now, after 32 years of depression and anxiety meds, I'm starting the process of getting diagnosed for ADHD. I'm grieving what could have been. Story 2. It can be an incredibly lonely profession. At most jobs, you can build rapport with coworkers and clients that have the chance to turn into close friends. But as a private practice therapist, all interactions have a firm wall of ethical boundaries that don't allow for anything beyond the sessions themselves. I used to be a bartender and would frequently have my regulars over to my house for a party or out to drinks. That is just not the reality, though, for a therapist. Story 3. Besides hearing about terrible things, there's really no dark secrets I have as a therapist. I would say one thing that people don't realize, or maybe don't consider, is how draining it can be on our own mental health. How much personal work. Over the years, I have worked with other newer therapists or therapists in training, and often they don't realize how far they allow their own mental health to decline before they are ready to work on their own past trauma. A lot of codependent people seek out helping fields, but will give until they are completely tapped out, and then start to resent their clients, or personal family members, or partners. Lori Gottlieb has a wonderful book that explains the process of therapy as well as the personal struggles of therapists in Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. Story 4. A part of the process to become a master's level licensed therapist involves many unpaid hours of internship. This is often inaccessible to those without a steady support system and the resources to do unpaid work while working towards a degree. Because you have to work many hours, unpaid, this breeds a field ripe for corruption. I have known of many therapist offices and agencies who will stack unpaid interns with a massive amount of clients, so the supervising therapist can bill insurances for the sessions under their name, while the intern gets paid in experience. The supervising therapist will then collect multiple insurance reimbursements as if they are the ones rendering services. Highly unethical and major fraud. Unfortunately, since you have to have the internship hours, interns have to go along with it or risk not getting the hours for graduation. Story 5. I'm in school to be one, but I'm already working with clients. I have serious concerns about the therapeutic skills of some of my fellow students. I fear they will harm their clients because of their own issues. Unresolved PTSD, subclinical borderline, narcissism. I'm as liberal as they come. But I've got a colleague who can't find it in themselves to express empathy for their conservative clients. On the other hand, one of our professors is explicitly racist. It's a mess. Don't be afraid to shop around. Yes, I remember listening to fellow therapists in training present cases, and the total lack of compassion for people who are not like them was extremely messed up. I operated at the other end. It was too draining for me to care so much all day long. I applaud anyone who can find and hold that balance. After I completed my practicum, I switched careers. Story 6. For U.S. therapists, the Patriot Act is an exception to confidentiality. Since the Patriot Act was passed, the FBI can request records from a therapist, among other entities. The Patriot Act is insane. The therapist has to provide them, and the therapist cannot inform the client that this has happened. Therapists don't always disclose this to clients because it tends to cause more harm than good. No therapist I know has ever had this happen to them, but it's extremely creepy that it exists. Story 7. Worked in homelessness, getting folks off the street and into housing. Worked hard for 3 months to get one person a lifetime housing voucher because they were disabled. Vouchers became more streamlined and had a bigger opportunity to make a difference for folks. Landlords in my state then started turning away people with vouchers under the logic that they did not earn 3 times rent. Since the voucher was only for the exact rental amount and utilities, was a case manager for in-home care, had a mother of 2 who was the home caregiver for her kids, paid by the state to give care, keep all the blinds drawn in the home 24/7, wouldn't let the kids go out and often rejected medical advice on their behalf. I think it was a case of Munchausen by proxy. Basically, the mother convinced them that they are sick, created conditions for them to be unwell, and got paid for it. CPS and medical teams couldn't do anything. Basically, the whole system is messed up. Left shortly after. Story 8. I don't know that there are any dark secrets per se. The only thing that comes to mind is when you're coming up against issues with systems and society, CPS, homelessness, inequality in general, etc. It can be hard to treat someone's mental health if their basic needs aren't being met. Mostly, we really just love our patients and want them to succeed and be happy. I genuinely care for all of my patients and think about them all the time. Meeting basic needs is tough at times. The state I worked in had a disgustingly low budget for mental health. Not to mention, I busted my butt firsthand working 2 jobs, going to college, and prepping to join the Marines while being homeless, because somehow I qualified for nothing. I stayed sober and stable through it all. The system sucks. Story 9. Inpatient psychiatric hospitals are often more damaging than helpful, but insurance doesn't care enough to actually pay for quality care. I worked at one and two young men were staying in a room together, both extremely psychotic. While one man was sleeping, the other one beat him bloody to the point his eyeball was hanging out. It happened in less than 5 minutes. Every patient is checked on every 15 minutes and wasn't heard over the sound of the other patients talking / the victim being asleep to begin with. It was only when I saw the roommate walking out covered in blood that staffing noticed. Sad thing was, both men were kind, previously successful students, with no prior aggression issues, and the roommate had hallucinated that the victim was trying to murder him, so he thought he was defending himself. This severity of an incident is rare, but smaller situations like this can be common among the more sick wards. Story 10. A lot of roles and jobs offered are like scams. Example, I got hired to be a substance use assessor for a county mental health agency contracted with a school. My role was to build every measure and point of contact for when a youth popped positive for a substance, if an athlete or caught vaping, that sort of thing. I was sent to specific county-wide meetings to face the only county mental health provider. I was paid less than $50,000 like 5 years ago and had to travel to 4 schools weekly. I quickly discovered the role and work I was doing was only to justify the district using funds, asking for a levy to buy sensors to put in bathrooms that can sense vaping. In the following school year, my position would no longer exist. I also quickly learned that being the only person with substance use treatment experience didn't make me likable. A principal at one school complained to me and my superior after I was asked to speak to an athlete and provide substance use prevention to them. The parents of the said athlete didn't like that I noted testing positive for cocaine is pretty impossible. I ended up being told how to do or not do my job that had been given to me and posited as this great way to network and meet people and develop connections, and ended up feeling like a dummy who could barely make rent so rich people with more money than I'll ever have can pretend their kids don't use drugs. Story 11. Few patients really want to change themselves. There are a lot of people out there who would rather complain. There is some hope that in the end they stop complaining and work on themselves. Many patients try to reach goals which are far away from therapy. Some of them even want to go on with criminal behavior and use therapy to do so. A mother got their girls back from custody and immediately let them visit the neighbor, if you know what I mean. I'm praying that it wasn't because of seeing a therapist that the judge returned the girls to her. Story 12. I have an uncle who is a therapist, but he's just some loser who exploited this thinking that has developed within the cultural zeitgeist, which holds up therapist as some priest class and a solution to all your worries, and got a bunch of qualifications to practice, yet he's the biggest loser I know. The man is in serious need of some counseling himself. I've met a few of his therapist pals, and they're the same troubled people trying to fix troubled people, pretending to care but gossiping about clients and getting rich off people's loneliness and misery. What value people get from these individuals, I have no idea. But this is just my anecdotal experience. Story 13. I'm going to repeat what a few of my fellow clinicians already mentioned. The profession itself is so lonely. We typically don't interact with colleagues, even in a group practice set, hour to hour. We are with the client. We know everything there is to know about them. They don't know a thing about us. Words can't describe how hard it is. It's no surprise then that a lot of us deal with SUDs. As for the clients, I'm shocked at how delusional parents can be. Their child will come in with significant issues and they'd sooner have them diagnosed with ADHD so they can feed them Ritalin than admit that they might be contributing to the issue. The parents usually are the issue. One more thing I'll add. People often make comments about how expensive therapy is. Given the amount of school we have to do, mine took 8 years and cost $150,000, Licensing costs about $850 for me this year alone because I'm taking a licensing test. Mandatory continuing education, which of course is good. Not free though. A year of working for free as an intern and any additional certifications, it's a damn steal for the client. You have to be truly passionate about helping others in order to survive this. Story 14. Not a therapist, but worked as a social worker deep in the mental health swamp, and have known many therapists personally as well as socially. And a whole lot of them are bat crap crazy in their own right. Many are narcissists whose self worth is bound up in their position of therapist. Once, an admitted psychiatrist at an elite hospital told me he was there because the choice was to be this side of the desk or over there, pointing to the chair the patient sat in. Not all, mind you, there are some amazing individuals out there, but a good number are drawn to the field, thinking they can fix themselves. Story 1. When I first started, I really wanted to do child psych. I absolutely love kids, and why not? Seemed like a good fit. Then I worked on a child psychiatric unit, and it changed everything for me. I heard so many god-awful stories, saw parents drop kids off at the unit claiming mental health issues, but really they wanted to party, as evidenced by multiple weekend admissions and showing up to the unit drunk for family meeting. The one that always stuck out to me was a 9-year-old who threatened to end his family. I had to interview him first, and the anger in his eyes was intense. He told me how his whole life, someone would leave him. No one took care of him. His family would abuse him, and despite having DCFS called, nothing happened. The part that I can still see is when he talked about how his grandmother set his dog on fire in front of him when she was high and mad. I didn't even know kids could feel that angry and rageful. I still think about him. It's been like 8 years. I hope he's okay. Story 2. There was a guy I had in the psychiatric intensive care unit that was utterly terrifying. I've dealt with a fair few violent people in my time, including a handful of people who had murdered some. But this guy was the scariest by a long shot. He was absolutely huge, had schizophrenia and probably some form of pervasive developmental disorder. It was hard to tell where one started and the other began. He didn't want to talk, he didn't want friends. He would explode into fits of violence with minimal provocation, and I never once saw him ever display anything close to empathy. One time I was taking him outside for a cigarette, and he started talking about the prostitutes he. I've never heard someone objectify another human the way he did. He didn't mention any violence specifically, but I simply couldn't believe that he hadn't murdered at least one. I said in what I hoped was an assertively compassionate voice, I think you should remember that those girls have feelings too, not even a flicker. I campaigned for him to be taken to a secure forensic setting. He got transferred back to his area, and the last I heard, they were discharge planning. I've treated a few patients from the 4 highest security hospitals in the country, and I would have swapped all of them to have that guy put away. Story 3. I had a kid who was always very charming and nice. He was maybe 15 or so. He seemed fine, and his parents only said that he was troubled. This was like our 5th session, so I asked him why they sent him to a counselor. He said, "They don't like that I'm gay." I was like, "Oh." So I emailed the parents to confirm this, and the email shook me to my core. They said that he had set a fire in the school, assaulted a teacher, and essentially tortured a kindergartner, K-12 school. I was freaked out, so when he came in next week, he was all happy. And when I questioned him about this, his face just went deadpan. He squared his shoulder and said, "The little cow deserved it anyways. And just to let you know, it felt good. Really good." My mom told that, "I'll leave her tonight. I'll take off her fingernails and put sewing needles in her eyes. Then he'll gut her. I'll find you and do the same." He then stood up very calmly and left the building. I called the police about this. As soon as I got off the phone with 911, this client sent me a video of him with a gun, putting it in his mouth and pretending to shoot. Story 4. Used to be a therapist at a behavioral health hospital. I had some patients who genuinely scared me in theory. Nothing ever happened with them. I was significantly attacked twice at work. Both patients were young women. Neither of them scared me beforehand. Both were incredibly quiet, withdrawn, and unassuming. One strangled me with my keys. My lanyard was a breakaway for that very reason, but she had tried to steal them several times in an attempt to escape the building and run into traffic, so I stupidly knotted off the breakaway portion. We carried panic buttons on the lanyards, and I was able to press it while being strangled with it. The other attack occurred when I was fairly new and on a low security unit in view of other staff. I was walking away from the patient, and she grabbed me by my hair, pulled me to the ground, and dragged me for several feet down the hallway, where she began kicking me in the chest and stomach. She was sent to a higher security unit as a result. I guess I was afraid of her after that. She wasn't there long. There was a law enforcement intervention after she assaulted a pregnant nurse, pulled her to the ground as well, and stomped on her stomach. Story 5. My mom used to be an advocate for children with mental disabilities. She had been assigned a new family that month, and they seemed pretty normal. Both parents checked out, and the kid was about 10 years old. He had a moderate case of autism and schizophrenia. The family also had a dog for the kid to play with. When the dog died, the parents decided to let the kid keep playing with it. No, they didn't stuff it. The kid played with the dead dog for a couple weeks before my mom realized what was going on. The kid would even sleep with the dog at night. Story 6. I'm not a psychologist. I did spend 5 months in a treatment center where we had to share our stories. The worst I heard, and really they were all the worst. But there are two that stick out the most. I'll share one due to the length. I'm not using many details to protect her privacy, but here goes. A young girl is living with her mother and father. Her only recollection of her father is that he was super nice to her, but mean to her mom. One day after her dad was particularly mean to her mom, they packed all of their stuff and left her childhood home to live with her mother's sister. This next detail was first brought up years after the end of the story. Her mother would stay up late at night worried for her life and the life of her children. She sat down with her sister at some point and said, "He's going to end me. I know he will. I want you to take care of my kids when he does." Imagine hearing that all those years later, knowing your mother knew she would die and didn't do anything to stop it. This girl had a brother and a sister, and one day on the way to her little brother's baseball practice, a large truck started following them. Her father was driving. He began to rear end the car, attempting to run them off the road. This was on a residential street. Eventually, the car was rammed into a tree. Her mother told the oldest daughter, the person I was in treatment with, to grab her cell phone and call 911, but she couldn't find the phone, so they got out of the car. At this point, her father climbed out of his car and drew his gun. He shot her mother and brother and then aimed the gun at her. He shot her in the shoulder, and before she lost consciousness, she told her younger sister to play dead. The whole family was rushed to the hospital, and the two girls were the only survivors. After he was arrested, they found a note in his car. It said something along the lines of, "I love them so much. If I can't have them, nobody can." Story 7. I had a client once who was diagnosed with pretty severe schizoaffective disorder. She believed her house was haunted and would tell me in vivid detail about a woman with really thin, stringy black hair without any eyes, just empty eye sockets. She said how she always saw her somewhere in the distance, getting closer. One night she stated that she woke up and the woman was staring at her smiling, this really wide smile in the corner of her room. Then she started whispering to her to end herself over and over. She also claimed that next morning she woke up and there was a kitchen knife on her nightstand that she had no recollection of placing there. That was pretty chilling to hear. In one of our sessions, as she started screaming and crying, claiming that the woman was right behind me. She also thought the woman stabbed me in the head during this session, and I was bleeding profusely. It was certainly hard to sleep after that. Story 8. I used to work for a children's youth group. There was a little girl there who was so sweet, but was missing most of her fingers on her right hand and her thumb was mangled. When I found out what her story was, I was horrified. Mom had checked out early on, major drug addict, and kids were left with dad, who was a borderline alcoholic with a bad temper. Well, one day when she was out with her dad, she was 3 at the time, she started throwing a temper tantrum over something. Dad got angrier and angrier, and when they got to their car, Dad grabbed the girl by the arm and proceeded to smash her hand between the car and the car door. Cops were called, obviously, and the girl went into foster care for her. Dad spent only 3 months in jail and had to attend anger management parenting. The girl was back with her dad fairly soon and lived in fear of him ever since. Story 9. I've had several clients with disturbing stories, but what really gets to me as a therapist is when I need to hospitalize a client. It's actually part of the job. If you come in and tell me you are going to end yourself, I have to have the police come get you and transport you to a locked inpatient facility. Sometimes this happens easily. The client knows it's the best thing for them and goes willingly. Sometimes it's less easy. The client rages, may or may not threaten me, and eventually flees, only to have the cops pull him and her over and transport the client to the hospital in the back of a squad car. Whatever way it happens, I will never get over that feeling of complete and utter sadness of watching someone I care about. Yes, good therapists actually care about their clients. Go into the hospital. I'm not sad because they went in, but because they so easily could have lied to me and gone home and taken their own lives. I'm lucky enough to have not experienced that, but I know if I keep practicing, then I probably will. So I guess the disturbing story is mine. I know that for all the work we do together, and as well as some people might seem to be feeling, anyone I meet with might choose to end themselves, and I may not be able to get them enough help first. Story 10 was in treatment last month, an adolescent place, residential/long-term treatment, and met a few strange stories. One young girl, 10 years old, had a newborn sister who was getting more attention from her mother than she had, and so attempted to end the baby for her mother's love. Another was adopted into a huge family, 11 years old, and constantly tried to strangle other children before she came to treatment, claiming that voices told her to. She constantly saw things and reported hearing threats, but I don't think she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She also had horrible panic attacks where she would stiffen and have tremors as if she were possessed. I've never seen panic attacks play out as horrible as they did for her. A few more I wouldn't be able to tell in depth, but from what bits and pieces I have, every person there had a pretty messed up story. Story 11. Disappointed in the popularity of this topic. I have to trust my therapist when he promises that anything I share is confidential other than with his own supervisor, with no identifying information, or if I'm a danger to myself or someone else. As a patient, I don't really care as long as there's no identifying information that traces back to me in the story. I think sharing stories is important to help educate people, even the worst of the worst stories, because those of us with mental health problems face so much stigma, and the only way that's going to go away is if we talk about it and let people ask questions. For instance, a couple of months ago, I was on a city bus where a man started having what I recognize as a schizophrenic break. His anxiety was skyrocketing. He clearly wasn't entirely sure of where he was. I recognized what was happening because I've dealt with a lot of my own mental illness and that of many people close to me. So I started to get out of my seat to go back and start talking to the man, to talk him off his proverbial ledge, when suddenly this big dude gets up, grabs the guy, and throws him out of the bus and onto the sidewalk. The driver then slammed the door shut and took off. I would like very much to never witness something like that again, and I think that the more people that can be educated on what really bad mental illness looks like and what kinds of trauma can cause mental illness, the lower my chances of seeing someone with the same disease as my grandmother get thrown on the sidewalk ever again will go down significantly. Story 12. A colleague, female therapist, was doing an assessment of a 4-year-old girl, and halfway through the session, my colleague noticed the girl had been scratching at her privates. She asked her why. The little girl proceeded to say it itches and hurts from the pen. More clarifying questions later, the girl exposed her pubis mound, showing a semi-fresh tattoo. Needless to say, the police called mom's boyfriend and arrested the girl in foster care. Summation: horrible parents got a real tattoo on their 4-year-old daughter's pubis mound. Don't know who did the tattoo, so assuming it was the boyfriend of the mother. Story 13. Would have to be a 14-year-old on probation. He had violated a random UA for meth use. The kicker was that he got the meth from his mom. They had been using it together. She showed up to one of his court hearings high on meth. The most disturbing thing was that she put on a front of being a caring parent and would talk at length about how she wanted to help him straighten out his life. The lady was a complete psychopath. Kid never had a chance. Generally speaking, though, there are a lot of CPS reports that I've had to review that I will never be able to unsee. It changes the way you view the world. Family Guy or South Park jokes about deviants that seemed hilarious in college are only dark because you know what people have actually done. It's also weird to just see all the normal-looking families out in the community doing their thing, and it just seems bizarre to think that there are parents with children out there that not only don't do everything they can to keep them safe, they actively demolish any sense of safety for the rest of their lives. On the plus side, it really makes me appreciate my own upbringing. My parents beat themselves up about imperfections, and my mom feels bad for imparting her anxieties. My dad constantly apologizes for the handful of times he yelled at me when I was acting like a little idiot. They clothed me, fed me, hugged me, and told me they loved me every day. I get to walk through life with no trauma, have normal relationships, and feel safe in the world around me. I just smile and tell them they have no idea how fine of a job they did. Story 14. Social worker rather than psychologist, but here it goes. Baby with fetal alcohol syndrome gets given up for adoption and is adopted by a couple. At his first birthday party, the dad, who is in a wheelchair, gets angry at someone at the party and somehow gets a gun and shoots the guy. The bullet goes through the guy and into the mom, who falls into the kid's crib and bleeds out and dies in front of him. The kid is then adopted by a distant relative of the original adoptive dad, who apparently has little interest in raising him because she is now only his mother in the loosest sense of. She refers to herself as his caregiver or something equivalent to that. This kid, a teenager now, loves her like a mother and doesn't understand that she really never saw him as a son. He's in a residential setting and thinks he will eventually get to go home to live with mom, but this is never going to happen. Story 15. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I am the patient of one, and we're sort of like best friends. She'll tell me stuff about her family. We love the same books and have the same sense of humor. Anyway, there was one day when I had an appointment, and she told me her record of worst thing a parent had said to a kid had been broken. She works with children, young adults, and families. The runner-up was a young man. She never mentioned what was wrong with him, but his mother had told him she'd rather end herself than live with him. My memory's not that great, but I think she said he had OCD. The worst one was absolutely horrifying, although really tame compared to some of the things I'm reading in this thread. It was a mother and daughter. The daughter had a severe eating disorder. Mother told the girl she wished that she'd had an abortion rather than give birth to someone so stupid and ugly. Story 16. I have a bunch, actually. Some from my professor's experiences and some from my own. One I heard was this. A young man suffered a severe head trauma after a motorcycle accident. The doctors were unsure of the extent of the damage, but he seemed normal and passed many of their tests to check for neurological damage. They allowed him to go, and he went home. About a week later, he went into a restaurant and sat down. He was alone, and as he began to eat what he had ordered, he noticed something bizarre. Across from him was a man who was looking at him intently, just staring. The man felt uncomfortable. He tried to look away and not notice, but each time he looked up, he saw the same thing. This mysterious man would stare at him. It got so bad that he had to call over the waiter. He asked him, "Would you please ask that man over there why he stares at me?" The waiter looked in the direction the man had pointed. He looks back at the man and says, "Sir, that's a mirror." Story 17. My degree is in client or counsel psychiatrist. I used to work in a group home with a young man who was diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome, bipolar disorder, psychosis NOS, PDD, autistic. He was born to a mother who was a drug addict, heavy drugs. When he was just a toddler, she would lock him in the bathroom by himself with a PB and J so she could go to a party. He is now doing very well, but has OCD focused around bathrooms and tools. I am now a crisis worker with a local hospital. The other day, a guy was brought in by his parole officers because he drove 5 hours away and could not remember anything. His parole officer said he never missed a meeting or drug test. When he was found, he didn't know his own name, his family, his childhood, nothing. He went to prison for child indecency. When he was told this, he refused it was him and insisted someone else did that. He had been with his parole officers for 2 years, and they insisted he wasn't acting. He convinced 3 psychiatrists that this was real, truly a case of a dissociative fugue state. When he signed his 201, the mother requested to see his signature, even though his signature had completely changed. Story 18. Once when I was a medical student, I was asked to see a patient in the psychiatric unit of the emergency. I walked in with my short white coat and clipboard and asked the guy what brought him in today and what was wrong. He looked me dead in the eyes with foamy saliva dribbling from the corner of his mouth and a strange smell in the air and said, "The devil told me to end you and end myself." He was sweaty and his eyes were bloodshot and his wife beater had dark red-brown stains on it. The door was behind him and I wasn't sure I could make it there before something bad happened. No idea if he had a weapon on him. Was afraid of calling loudly for help. I was in a quiet corner of the ER, and I felt like I would have had to yell to get attention and I didn't want to startle him. I stayed there for a half hour and asked him more questions. Slipped out when he started to look sleepy. Story 19. I'm a therapist, but not a psychologist, if that matters. I used to work in a facility for kids and adolescents with pretty intense behavioral issues. Even when a client was aggressive, I was usually able to de-escalate them, and I generally didn't feel unsafe. In fact, most of the time I was concerned about their safety during outbursts. With one exception, I had a client that was pretty strong and prone to intense tantruming. This client was acting in a way that was unsafe, had a plan to seriously hurt another resident, I think, so I had to put them on restriction, within staff eyesight at all times. Their response was to run up to me and attempt to choke me. Luckily, the staff got there in time and prevented this kid from seriously hurting me. On another occasion, this same client also took apart their curtain rod in their bedroom and swung it at my head. I dodged it. Oddly enough, this client and I had a pretty good relationship the other 99% of the time, and I generally enjoyed working with. Story 20. A very sweet, mostly blind teenager who was going through his first psychotic break and had a love of martial arts, taekwondo, if I remember correctly. Like, was really, really, really good at it. He couldn't see and would practice kicks, and at one point, accidentally kicked one of the reinforced, shatterproof windows in the quiet room. Think padded room without the padding. Turns out they were shatter resistant. He destroyed it with that kick. Why those particular details? Because he would practice his kicks everywhere. Was mostly blind, and the one time he flipped up to practice one and I was walking around the corner, it came literal centimeters from my face, and I felt the impact of it against the air, like a physical force bashing into my face. Sweetest kid in the world, he would have been horrified connected, because things would have broken, a lot of things. He also grabbed my arm once in a sudden firm grasp and asked if I wanted to do taekwondo with him. No, I did not.